Hello, everybody, and welcome back for episode number 2 of Simple Saltwater Saturdays. I appreciate you all being here. For those of you that missed it, on the first episode, we discussed tank size, some of the do's and don'ts and things that we feel are appropriate for new people coming over from freshwater into saltwater. And this series is all about simplifying saltwater, making it easy for people that have never even touched a saltwater aquarium to be able to transition into that. Today we're going to be discussing the water in and of itself, some things that you should know, some different terminology, some things you should do, shouldn't do, and some things that maybe you can get by with depending upon what type of setup you're going with. So we have, of course, my buddy, my pal, Chattanooga Ed here. He is our beginner in saltwater, never done a saltwater tank before. Myself being the intermediate in saltwater and reef tanks, and of course, Mike from the Fish Tank Barn, our expert, if you will. Up to the point of even breeding saltwater fish. So thank you both for being here. Appreciate it. I think this is going to be a fun conversation tonight.
Not a problem.
I do want to preface a lot of the things I say with, before you take what I say, go, well, Fisher Beaver said this. I think the basic point that you need to start with in terms of the water and how you're going to make your salt water, and some of the things we'll talk about tonight, is having in mind what your end result is. Meaning, are you going to go with a fowler, FOWLR, which is fish only with live rock, or are you going to go with a reef tank? Are you going to have corals in there? That can make and does make a huge difference in terms of what type of water myself and I'm sure Mike will also recommend you start with, because you can run into a lot of different things that we'll talk about tonight. So let's start with the basics, rock bottom, salt level. Mike, do you want to tell people a little bit about salinity and a couple different ways that you can measure it and kind of what you're looking for? So I've got my freshwater tank. I guess first question, can I just dump salt in my freshwater tank and make it a saltwater tank? I'm sure people wonder that.
It is recommended that you mix the salt water outside of the tank in a container. I would either get a Rubbermaid trash barrel, or if you know someone who works either at like a pop bottle distillery, or if you look on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, etc., get like a food grade 55-gallon drum.
Absolutely.
Those are the recommended. What I would actually do to mix it is get an air stone. I'll maybe let it sit overnight. So I'll get like a never clog air stone, put it in there, mix it up overnight, and then test it with a refractometer. Don't use the swing arm. I think we talked last time about the swing arm hydrometer. Those can have issues. So, yeah, really, especially if you have fish, do not dump the salt directly in the tank. That could cause a lot of problems.
Absolutely. And I'm sure some people will be wondering this because a lot of us, especially those of us that are deep into the hobby already with multiple freshwater tanks, 5-gallon buckets is another option if you don't have room for like a 55-gallon drum. The tote, like you mentioned, is a great option. I recommend everybody have some plastic storage totes anyways. They're great for, moving fish around, quarantine tanks, things of that nature. And even if you've got, an extra tank that's hanging out, maybe you've got an empty 10 or 20 or something like that, you could have that specifically for a mixing station. Like Mike mentioned, having an air stone running, fairly simple stuff. I will say, if you're going to go with the hydrometer with the swing arm device, one thing you definitely want to do, if you're dead set on using one, because I'll be honest, I have one. I know Ed purchased one recently. Make absolutely sure that you're rinsing that thing extremely well with fresh water after you're done with it every time, so that you don't get any salt buildup on the arm, because that's where you can definitely see some variance as you go to test it. You've got dried up salt that's accumulated on there, and it gives you a false reading because it floats based upon the density in the water and how much salt there is in there. So if you've got extra salt hanging on that arm, that's extra weight, and that's going to throw off your reading. But as the Zen Ginger pointed out, a refractometer only costs about $20 to $30 online for a basic model.
And make sure to buy the calibration fluid with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is definitely a worthwhile investment. If you're going to be getting into saltwater, it's one of those things that just go ahead and do it now versus the upgrade later. I know a lot of times on the freshwater side, we'll get into things, and how many times have we all purchase something and then we end up just upgrading it later anyways? We went the cheap route maybe, and we're like, you know what, this just isn't going to do it. Let me go ahead and get the thing I actually need. And that coming from me, who is kind of the master of cheapness, if you will, in terms of like some of my LED lighting and things that I do in do-it-yourself projects and box filters out of trash. So keep that in mind. So we've got our mixing container.
It's a lot more expensive when you do it in saltwater, though.
Yeah, absolutely. it definitely, and people oftentimes worry about the cost of saltwater. That is definitely one of those places where if you do it right the first time, it will save you considerable amount of money oftentimes. Not just in having to, buy a different product, but also in getting the precision that you are looking for in saltwater. Maybe we have a little bit more leeway in freshwater for parameters to be off. Saltwater, you really want to, again, like we've talked about before, requires more patience and definitely a bit more precision. But I don't want people to be scared because
no, absolutely. You have to get into it, and then there's a learning curve like with anything, right? I mean, with any fish, anything new, there's a learning curve. But as you get into it, you kind of get the idea of it. Go and watch all the videos, watch the Me Loves Reefs, watch the Richard Rosses of the world and all those people, and then you can just learn as you go along.
Absolutely, and I've equated it many times, to the freshwater side and having a reef tank comparing to a plated tank, and that's I was really happy I had one of those. That's what I said moments. I heard somebody on Aquarium Call had asked Corey, "Do you think saltwater is hard?" Essentially, he's like, well, no, I think it's just a matter of comparing it to these things. I don't look at it any different than doing a nice, plated tank. Basically the same thing. It's like, yeah, all right.
I always have equated the super hardcore planet tank guy and the super hardcore reefer are the same people.
Yes,
they're literally the same people.
Yes, with maybe a $10,000 budget difference, even though the really hardcore planet tanks are still expensive.
Oh yeah.
And you don't have to go that deep into it, but I've seen $50,000 reef tanks in some really high-end homes.
Oh yeah,
and that is honestly one of the things that kind of scared me away at first from saltwater years and years ago. But I digress. All right, so we're gonna get a mixing container. We're gonna get hopefully a refractometer, possibly a hydrometer to check our salinity or our salt content, how much salt we have in that water.
Now, can I ask a question?
Always, buddy.
Is the refractometer, is that the one that looks like a lightsaber?
Yeah, it kind of looks like a lightsaber handle.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
it's got a little flip. Got it right here. Actually, I meant to get this, but make sure I had this before, but luckily it's here. So it's this right here.
Yep.
Yeah. Diego was showing me one, and I thought he was showing me a lightsaber, and I'm like, well, that's neat.
And then all you do is you take like a pipette and you stick the water on here. I'm not going to.
Oh wow!
So it's good in the camera. So you stick it on there, then you flip that over and you look in the viewfinder. There's a viewfinder this way.
Oh wow!
You look in the viewfinder. There's a little blue area, like a blue line that will show you where your salinity should be.
How in the world does it figure that out?
It's through the light. You'll have to point it at the light.
You get to feel like a real scientist playing with it.
Yeah, crazy.
So in terms of salt, there are a lot of different salts out there, and I'm not necessarily looking for a brand preference. But you're welcome to give one. But I feel like there is some difference in terms of your basic salt versus your salts that are intended for reefs. Do you take that into consideration, or do you have?
I've always used Instant Ocean, even when I had the tank like behind me, and I've always used that. They use it at the Georgia Aquarium. They use it for the kill of the whale shark and everything else. And I'm like, it's been around forever. And I know there's stuff out there that there's others. There's Fritz makes salt. There's a brand called ESV, which is a lot of what the hardcore guys use, where you can mix the pieces together yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always used Instant Ocean, and I've always been pretty happy with it.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, like you mentioned, if it's good enough for them, that's good enough for me. And I'm on the same page. I know, like you said, there's hardcore reefers out there that will go with the reef specific stuff that have extra things added to it. But I feel like that's almost a complicating factor at first versus adding ease for somebody that's just getting into salt.
I like to keep it simple because I think you would add a lot of the things that those have in it. You would add that with a calcium reactor, for example. And I know that's going way farther beyond what we want to go to. But you can set up a calcium reactor and do the same thing as buying the $100 salt versus the $50 salt. All
right. So I've got my bucket or my tote, my drum, whatever container I've choose to use. I've got my box of Instant Ocean. This is where I don't want to say you and I will clash, but there are definitely some varying ways to do this. And again, this is dependent upon the outlook. You being the what we'll call legitimate saltwater aquarist, you're very much a fan of RO, correct?
I am, but I'm not at the same time. I've actually I'm going to see how it works, and I probably will have to go do RO eventually. But you should use RO. But I have taken the RO part out. Mm-hmm. You should use RODI, which is the deionization. So I took the RO part out, and I've actually just made it a push filter with the DI resin at the end of it.
Okay. And I will say, if you were going to, or even think you might be planning to do any type of corals down the road, you're not just going to do the Fowler, the fish only with live rock. I definitely recommend you use the not tap water, not straight tap water. That being said, I have done tap water and salt, of course, still dechlorinated as you would in fresh water for some of my fish only with live rock tanks. You will definitely see some different algae issues come up because of the things in your tap water, which is why I mentioned you really don't want to have to fool with that when you've got coral in there. You don't want these algae overwhelming your corals and killing them off. But I've never worried too much with some of the algae that will pop up from phosphates and things like that, that you really have issues with out of your tap. If you're just doing, fish and rock in there. So if you're going, well, man, I want to set up this, 220 gallon predator tank with this lionfish and this eel and this type of stuff, but maybe I can't set up an RODI because of not having enough water pressure, which is something we'll talk about maybe a little bit more here, but I'm sure definitely an RODI video is in the works. And maybe I don't have a store I can just go buy it from. So tap water is kind of my option for something that big. I've done that before, and I would say you're probably going to be fine with that. However, again, stressing from the quote-unquote cheap guy here, if you're going to be doing corals, I highly recommend you use the purified water to do so. It's one of those instances you're going to be better off taking the time and maybe the slight money difference to do it right there versus trying to come back and fighting algae, because it's so hard to get the stuff stripped out of the water once it's in the tank. And to get rid of the algae and to get your corals safe from the growth and the algae and all that, I really just recommend it. A lot of work. Yeah, it is a lot of work. You don't want to put yourself through, especially if you're trying to do your first saltwater tank. You're doing, simple saltwater.
And the rocks have a lot of crevices too, right?
Yes.
And so, like, the algae will get into every little nook and cranny, and it's very difficult to get out. It's a little bit different than freshwater in that aspect if you use that kind of rock. It's really tough to get that algae or other things out of it.
Absolutely. And just a quick Google search here, just what's popping up. I see things, RO units, everywhere from $60 to $150, and I'm sure they go upwards from there. But like the one I'm seeing on Bulk Reef Supply is a 4-stage unit that would do everything you would ever need it to do, have all the different membranes. It's $150. You could probably find one for slightly less, I am sure. So just something to keep in mind if you are looking into getting into corals. I go and I buy my water premix, which is another thing we can talk about here shortly. And that's just a matter of ease for me. With having as many tanks as I do at this point, and having a very limited saltwater setup, it's not worth my time investment to set up to create saltwater and pre-stage it the night before and mix it, when I can just take a 5-gallon jug down there, or however many I need for my water change, get them filled up for $1 a gallon, be exactly the salinity I need, and move on with life. And same thing, I can buy my RO DI water for top-offs, which we're going to talk a little bit more about top-off water versus water change water. But we've got those things set up. We're getting ready to mix our salt water. We've got our refractometer or hydrometer. What are we shooting for? What numbers are we looking for here?
There's a number of like 1.026, which is the specific gravity of the salt of basically seawater.
And that is,
and I believe it's 35 parts per thousand. I could be wrong on that one though.
I feel
per thousand it's been a while.
Yeah, I feel like that's accurate, but I think it's probably been over a decade since I've looked at parts per thousand. But yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of a baseline status quo in the saltwater side, if you will, of what you're looking for in your salts. You will come across things, as with, in freshwater, you'll find things that vary. Some things might like it slightly more, a little bit more salinity, slightly under, but that's kind of your baseline, is that 1.026.
Now, fish can tolerate a little bit less. I would run my clownfish setup at 1.020.
Mm-hmm.
Because the fish can, if you're just doing fish, you can go a little bit less, but you have to be careful with that.
Absolutely.
Because fish do fine going down in salinity, but you have to very slowly bring them back up.
So Chris Trapp has a good question. And hello, Paul McCarthy. I didn't want you to think I was passing over the highlighted comments. We'll definitely be taking highlighted comments and questions throughout this. But Chris Trapp says, any preferred shop for saltwater supplies, Bulk Reef Supply, Petco, LFS, ? I know a lot of people don't have a local fish store, but I would say, generally speaking, there are exceptions, as with anything. If you have a local fish store that you have found to be trustworthy and a good place to support with your freshwater hobby that does saltwater, that's where I would recommend. So I'm very blessed. Aquatic Marine, my local fish store. They're amazing at salt and freshwater. Chattanooga Ed, his local fish store. Aquatic Aesthetics, another awesome shop. He's awesome with fresh and salt, and I've bought fresh and salt from both of those shops. That being said, a lot of people may not have an LFS, or they may not have a trustworthy LFS. Definitely Bulk Reef Supply. At least I know, 10 years ago, when I was really in the saltwater side, maybe even more than that now. It was, it's kind of like a staple. Is there any place else that's popped up that you would recommend? Because I'm not really up to date on the online saltwater.
Not purchased from them, but there's a place like saltwater AQUARIUM.com or something that's fairly newish, but I'm not sure. So yeah, Bulk Reef Supply is really the place. If you want to support more of a hobbyist level, maybe like Me Loves Reef as well. He does have a shop with some items on it. He sold RO units for years.
There you go.
So he's got I don't know if he still does. I bought mine like 10 years ago, so it's been a while. But a lot of the times, if you're looking for some specific stuff, you may not find it at the local fish store, just because it's not probably profitable for them to carry something like a reef octopus skimmer, for example.
Right.
So those things, I'll either do like a Bulk Reef Supply, and you kind of have to go look around for some of the products, because some stores have certain products and some stores don't. Just depends on the product, because they'll carry certain lines. But generally, Bulk Reef Supply has been pretty good. Mark, Me Loves Reef, and then your local fish store as well. Like I like to buy salt from the local fish store, for example.
Absolutely.
It's actually cheaper than Amazon.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say, if you're going to go the Amazon route, either for want or need, it's one of those things, even on the freshwater side, I would avoid a lot of the quote unquote knockoff brands because you don't really know what you're getting into. Try and stay with some of the things that are more name brand. But even more than that, look at reviews. And that's one thing Ed is wonderful about. Like, he showed me a light and he was like, well, this thing's probably pretty good. I'm going to pay an extra $30 for it because it's got 1,000 reviews and a 4.5 star rating versus the one that's $30 cheaper that has, what was it, a 3-star rating? Yep. So I think that's oftentimes a great way to find things as well if you need to go that route. Petco, PetSmart. I don't know if PetSmart has any salt stuff on, but yeah, I know Petco, you can get some things. So that is an option as well. Just keep in mind. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. There is one thing I'll tell you not to buy, and I'm probably going to get, actually, I won't say it. I'll get in trouble.
No, say it just in case I bought it.
Do not buy the Cyclone skimmer. There's something called the it's been out for 1,000 years, but it's better for other DIY things than it is as a protein skimmer, and you'll find that at Walmart and not Walmart, but Petco and PetSmart.
Gotcha.
I forgot it wasn't my channel. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Those are things that people need to know, especially, a majority of people in here have no clue in terms of saltwater and saltwater brands. That was one thing I kind of thought of in my mind. I'm like, I'm shooting myself in the foot because I'm saying a name brand, and a lot of name brands may have changed since I was really deep into saltwater, and also people new to the saltwater side may not know what a name brand is. I would say look for a reputable website, and there are a lot of companies that cross over into saltwater that we're familiar with from the freshwater side. Before I dive into my next segment here and get Mike on another question, I want to say a huge thank you to Stephanie Dominguez. Welcome to the Fish Room Fever family. Thank you for joining the team and becoming a member. The fanfare and the party poppers and the applause. I appreciate you. Now, I did upload, it finally finished processing where I could release that members-only video from the other day. So I made that live for the members about 30 minutes before this started. So after we get done here, be sure and go check that out. And I hope you enjoy all the behind-the-scenes content. Doing a lot of that lately, and we'll continue to do that. But I appreciate you very much, Stephanie. Welcome to the Fish Room Fever family. All right, so we know kind of what we need to mix the salt. We know what we're looking for in terms of how much salt we need. One thing, I don't know how deep we want to go into this, but it is a variable, or at least something that I always understood as a variable, was temperature affects the salinity level, the salt water. I don't know if that has been, after a decade kind of pushed aside, because there's a lot of, things change in any hobby, the saltwater side especially.
I've not heard that. That doesn't mean it's not true. I just haven't heard it.
Right. Absolutely. So it is not noteworthy enough to even discuss at this point. But it's something that, I'd heard, so I wanted to bring that up. I always just fix it room temperature. And then if you're in a place where your room temperature is going to be too cold, throwing a heater in that mixing container. I know that was a common thing because not everybody heats their whole house, right? A lot of us do because we have fish rooms. So if you've got a fish room that's temperature controlled or climate controlled to the likings of your fish, that works out well. But if you're keeping your house cool, or maybe it's cool and you don't quite get it warm enough to fish tank temperature, you can definitely use a heater to warm that up before you add it to your tank. So let's talk a little bit about something that we definitely want to address and make people aware of on the saltwater side of things, because it's a huge change from, okay, I've done all this freshwater, I'm used to doing water changes, water out, water in, water out, water in. And that is doing a top off versus doing a water change, and the different water that we would use for that.
So when your tank evaporates, it only evaporates the fresh water. So your salinity will actually go up as your water evaporates. So you would want to top off with fresh water. And when you're doing a water change, you want to go ahead and do With salt water, obviously, you're taking the salt out, you're putting new salt in. You just want to make sure it's the same salinity or very close to the same salinity as the water that you've taken out.
Absolutely. Now, do you have a what's the best way for me to phrase this?
Auto top off.
Oh yeah, auto top off's one thing, but in terms of, I'm doing my water change. I'm still new to salt. I'm kind of nervous. I don't want to screw things up. Do you have like a certain amount of water that you put in at a time in terms of, I'm just going to dump the 5 gallons in, or I'm going to pump it in at 200 gallons per hour, or I'm going to slowly put the new water in?
I try to set the ecosystem up so I don't do a lot of water changes. But when I do, I'd say like 20%.
Okay.
Like I really am big in saltwater of making the ecosystem work for you. I guess the one thing you do have to keep in mind though is when you to do water changes, especially with corals, you are replacing nutrients that may get taken out by the corals. For example, like calcium for specific types of corals. So there is definitely benefits to doing water changes. And it's weird for me because I have like auto water change, so like I've not done a like legitimate like real like get the hose and do a water change in quite a long time.
Gotcha. But basically, as long as you're not adding the water in at a level that's disrupting the corals and substrate and just blasting stuff everywhere, you
Right.
feel pretty safe with just adding it in at a
Reasonable clip.
a reasonable constant rate, versus, I'm doing a saltwater change. I need to, I don't want to say drip acclimate, but do a slow flow to put the new water in. That was something.
One thing that people probably don't realize is in the ocean there's quite a bit of flow.
Yes.
And something we'll probably cover at some point as we go through this is covering the flow, but there's quite a bit of flow in the ocean, so the corals are kind of used to getting battered around a little bit with some flow.
Yeah, and that not to digress, but absolutely that's beneficial and necessary for a lot of corals to have that high flow because it keeps particulates off of them and keeps them clean, so to speak. Multiple Aquarium says, Mike, do you use dosing pumps?
I'd like to, and it's not set up right now. I'm still working on setting up the reef tank, but I do. I use auto top off for dosing pumps. I've really not used dosing pumps. I generally use calcium reactors if I'm going that route, but I've always run bigger tanks, and calcium reactors seem to be a more economical solution for a larger tank.
Gotcha. Absolutely. All right. I think I caught everything up to here. I do want to say feel free to throw in your questions or comments. If you'll put at Fisherman Fever, that will highlight for me and it will make it stand out so that I don't miss it. Is there anything? I think that's kind of the bare bones basics of saltwater and water chemistry. I know there are a lot more things we can get into, and we'll probably do an advanced episode on this down the road in terms of your phosphates and all the different things, magnesium and all that stuff. And
calcium, dosing vodka, dosing vinegar,
yes.
The whole.
But I think that's for the basics of what you need to know. I think that fairly well covers it. I guess the other thing I would ask is, I've done all this, my first saltwater tank. I've got my sand into the tank. and we're going to talk substrate and rock next week. So keep that in mind, folks. Or not next week, but next episode.
I want to grab Chris's question.
Yeah, good for it.
So he's asking, what are the main parameters being monitored aside from salinity? To start with, it's basically the same as your freshwater. It's nitrate, and ammonia.
And then temperature.
And temperature. Yeah, but I always forget.
Well, no, you're fine. I'm on a temperature kick and a heater kick right now. But yeah, that's like you said, just like freshwater. Those are the things that we are accustomed to looking for, at least in theory. So that transitions over to the saltwater side, and it's something that we're already familiar with. Maybe we're looking for different levels on those parameters.
But it's different, or it's just different colors, right? There are different colors on the,
All right. I like that one there. Mike's Aquatics and Things says, Mike, not cheap, but a budget light recommendation, RGB or question mark.
All right. So it depends on what you want to do. And all these things depend. Like if you're doing a fowler, I would actually do the blue and white night group. If you're just doing a fowler with fish, no corals, nothing else, I would do, and then Ed's got one that's, it's sort of a step up slightly from the Chinese black box, the Via Spectra. There's also what I ended up getting for it's gonna end up being a 180 gallon tank, and you start getting into not so budget at that point because you need a few for LEDs. But you've got brands like Reef Breeders. I ended up going with a brand called Reef Bright, and they're called Lumalights, and they're almost like little sticks. They're little sticks, and so I bought like one. There's one that's a 50/50, and then there's one that's an actinic, which is the blue light. So I'm going to go off the reservation here a little bit, and it's going to be. But you really like in your Planet tank, you want something that's like a 6500K. When you're doing salt, you're kind of going for that 1200K look, so it's going to be a lot more blue.
Absolutely.
So the way I did it is I did one 50/50 and then two actinics. Okay. The way I set that up. So they're two 72-inch, basically sticks.
Absolutely. Now, Ed, do you care to share with folks how much that light was that you were showing there? Because I think that's a decent quality light. I think that's a good budget light that you purchased there.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have them in different sizes too, and I actually got the smallest length one because I've got a small length tank. But it was I think $129 for this.
And if
another one that I thought of too, sorry to interrupt, was the AI primes as well. So they're about $200, and most of the lights, LEDs that you'll find will do a 24 by 24 inch area.
And that is one thing that's come a long way from 10, 12, 15 years ago is to get a light like that. Back when I was really into reefs, you were looking at an easy $400 or $500 because LED really wasn't a thing, if not more. So the fact that those are so readily available, they're budget, they're efficient, I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing for the saltwater side of the hobby.
Yeah, I've got a question for you guys.
Yes, sir.
Now, it came with like this hanger, and this cable was way at the end, and I started pulling it through just to see what lengths, but it won't go the opposite direction.
You've got to push. There's a little pin in it. You got to push it in, and then you should be able to pour it back out.
Absolutely.
Oh, they're awesome. I spent hours trying to figure that out.
All right. So T and Aqua was wondering what size tank you're setting up, Ed.
It's a 50 tall. I could actually turn my camera around and show you guys if you want.
It's almost like an oversized cube in terms of the height. I love it for salt. I know a couple of people have said that's horrible for salt, but I love that right there. It's like a cube, but taller.
Yeah, it's going to be right there.
That looks taller than it did in the other picture.
Yeah, it's very deceiving.
31 inches tall, I think.
Wow.
And it's 20 by 18 base.
Yeah, my dinosaur arms won't reach into the bottom of that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I mentioned to him is, Ed has created this piece of rock to go in there. And it sits...
18 inches high.
Yeah, 18 inches. So
I measured it. That's why I know.
Yeah, because we had talked about the height on it. So that helps in terms of if you've got corals that are not going to get enough light at the very bottom of it, which I'm going way off topic. But it gives you some different depths that you can place things at. Carol Cox for that $5 super chat. Thank you very much, Carol. Very much appreciate that. It's always a pleasure to see you here. She says, what are the components of a balanced saltwater ecosystem that reduces water changes?
Ooh, great question.
Absolutely fantastic.
That's a great question. Basically, it's almost like what Corey says with the planted tank. So instead of having plants, the corals do absorb, and they do eat. They're animals; they do eat. But also, you have the cleanup crew like snails and hermit crabs and things like that. And then you set up in the sump. You'll have like some like catamorpha, which is an algae,
Mhm.
and then you harvest that as it grows, and then you either pitch it or you can take it and give it to someone or do whatever with it. But basically, that will absorb all the nutrients.
Absolutely. And then you have like your live rock is a very crucial factor, not just because it looks nice in there and you can do all sorts of designs, but your live rock does a lot of work in terms of your filtration to help keep things balanced as well. Um, it, I don't know if there even is any more recommended pounds per gallon, so to speak.
Not really.
Okay, there used to be like, oh, you want 5 pounds per gallon or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but think of it in terms of the more rock you have in there is almost like the more sponge filters you have in a freshwater tank. That's a great way to think of it. I feel like it's simplified down. Of course, there's some saltwater people that are going, no, it's all real technical, and there's technical aspects to it. But
I mean, the one thing I will say is that don't get caught up in the equipment craze, because saltwater is very equipment driven. There's always a new something.
Yes.
It's always like, so I've always been if it's working for you, it's not broke, don't fix it. Don't go fixing it, because you can make it worse.
Absolutely. And I feel, again, very much relating to the plant side in freshwater. It seems like that's the thing in the high-tech planet. There's always this new glass bubble counter that's coming out, or this new high-tech thing for planted tanks. It's the end-all be-all. So, yeah, absolutely. Don't get caught up in the equipment hype. I think that's a very great way to put that.
I mean, there are some brands that are tried and true in saltwater. There's, the Ecotax of the world, things like that. They're kind of like the aquarium co-ops of, I'll use that, of freshwater, right? There's bulk reef supply, people like that. So I kind of go with the trusted brands. I know Via Spectra's been out for quite a while now. So just kind of do a little bit of research on some of the brands too.
Absolutely. And I would put this in your mind. We have products that come out in the freshwater side that are the miracle thing, the miracle cure. There was that box that you dropped it in your tank and it made your water perfectly clean and clear and fixed all of your everything, nitrates and all that. Just process things on the saltwater side like you would from the freshwater side, in terms of, if somebody says this is going to fix all your problems, go, well, if somebody were trying to sell me that on the freshwater side, I'd be very skeptical that this is the end-all be-all fix it. And just kind of, like Mike said, do your research.
There's a lot of snake oil stuff. I mean, there's things called, it'll make do not buy the purple stuff. It will make your tank purple either.
So, Chris Trapp, this is a great question, and this plays into the Cato, like you mentioned. Can you grow plants in saltwater? So, I think one of my favorite setups that I've seen is actually a little 5-gallon fluval spec in an Atlanta fish store. And it is essentially a saltwater planted tank. What they did was they took all the different macro algae, which is what you're really looking at in terms of plants in saltwater, or the macro algae. And they had it set up with those as you would a planted tank if you were aquascaping. And what that was doing was, it gave you that aesthetically pleasing look and that design and the different colors and the plant life, but it was also filtering that water and going towards that balanced ecosystem, like Carol Cox was mentioning. Mike, you probably know off the top of your head more.
No, those are pretty much it. I mean, I think there might be some mangroves or something. Some people do that, but generally, yeah. I mean, it's the macroalgae, which I haven't played much with. Honestly, it's been more of a. I usually use the the catamorpha, but.
Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Multiple Aquarium says, what do you think about Kessel's, Fisherman Fever and Mike? So I've never used them. Kessel, you want to send me some to try out? I'd be happy to do it, as would Mike, I'm sure. I've never used them. So Mike, I'll defer that to you.
If I were spending that money, and this is my personal bias, right? There's probably nothing wrong with Kessels. I would get, if you're going to spend that kind of money, I'd go ahead and buy the Ecotechs.
Gotcha. Now, I think one thing you hear a lot of people, I don't want to say justify, but mention, they get the Kessels and they go, it has that Kessel shimmer, that Kessel shine. I do feel like the Kessels have a very particular water shimmer light spectrum thing they've got going on, to put it in not technical whatsoever terms. But I really feel like you're paying for the name on that. Not that it's not a high quality product, but that's definitely a lot of money to invest in.
From my experience with them,
mm-hmm.
I think that they're set up to make a spotlight.
Mm-hmm.
So they literally will make a ring in your water and go out from there. And that's what you think there's more of a sparkle, because there's dark zones
mm-hmm.
by using them. I mean, they're beautiful, and it's a trick you do in photography. And that I've seen it and that's what the Castle's doing. It's doing it's making a spotlight on particular parts of your tank.
Right. And Daniel, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead. It's all right.
I was just going to say, Daniel Velez kind of came to that without mentioning the spotlight. We said Kessels are great, but super expensive. They're good for depth. And that's
mm-hmm.
exactly it. They have that more targeted spotlight, so it gets a deeper, it penetrates deeper to where you need to get more light to.
But they are beautiful.
They really are.
James and I, we get to
yeah.
see them at Sean Peck's house.
Yeah.
And,
I think it's safe to say if money were no object, we would all have Kessels, right?
Yeah, it's either that or the Ecotech. And I'm, like I said, I'm a little bit of kind of an Ecotech fan person when it comes to saltwater stuff. But
that's totally fair.
Somebody had asked if there was a saltwater setup behind me. I don't have any saltwater in this room. So I have a 110-gallon planted freshwater community tank, the axolotl tank right here, and then, of course, that tank you all are familiar with, the bucktooth tetras. But thank you very much. I appreciate the said it looks good or nice or something. Thank you. Appreciate the compliment. That's the word I was looking for. Where is it? Is a sump necessary? That was Chris Trapp says, is a sump necessary?
No, you don't have to have a sump. They even make sort of hang on the back refugiums
mm-hmm.
as well, which are sort of the best way I could describe it is kind of like an AquaClear.
Yeah.
That you can put on the back of your tank. So you do not need a sump. Again, it depends on what you want to do. It all comes down to there's a million ways to. I'm gonna use a different term than skin the cat,
right.
But I don't have one. There's different ways to skin the cat in the aquarium hobby with saltwater and freshwater, and so you can definitely do it without a sump.
There's more than one way to clean the glass.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because my tank is so long, I had to come up with something. So I took my flugel hose here, and then the end of the attachment, I put rubber band here so that way it would stick better. And that's going to give me my extra length to the bottom of that extra long tank.
Oh, very nice.
Nice.
So
what do you plan on putting in that tank?
2 clownfish and a shrimp.
And
That's
a coral.
What I was thinking for that.
And a coral.
And one coral.
Yeah.
And one coral. Which coral?
I bought the coral. It
yes.
was $10 at the swap.
It's at my house.
Okay, so I'm like, where is this coral? Is it just sitting in the bag?
Yeah, no. He's got it in the bag in the freezer to keep it fresh.
I want to see you guys pull this off.
Yeah,
it was really pretty little blue coral.
Yeah, and it's doing well. I got some zoanthids from the swap, so that was awesome. That was my thing to get me. That really got me back into the reef tanks, was I missed my zoanthids so much. So I'm having fun with that. And I've got a 55-gallon that's just got all my rock and sand for my next project that's just sitting in there because that rock's been in use for years now. So it's got some nice coralline algae growth and all that stuff. And I want to keep it seasoned. Essentially, it's like keeping your sponge filter seasoned, if you will. A couple questions there. And that was T and Aqua. Thank you, T and Aqua, that asked if that was a salt setup and said it looked great. I appreciate that, Bobby.
So I want to say hi to Haley. I did run into Haley last weekend at the Michiana Aquarium Society's Kili Carnival. So definitely it was nice seeing Haley in South Bend, Indiana.
Haley's super cool.
Absolutely.
Well, so I am going to probably have to figure out how to get 50 gallons of salt water from my aquarium store, and we're almost out of gas in my town. So I've got to figure a lot of logistics here.
Yeah,
Hand truck.
Yeah.
What did you say?
A hand truck.
I have no idea. What's that mean? A hand
dolly.
truck?
No, like a dolly.
Oh!
Like a dolly.
Oh,
Like a,
yeah. Oh, I have 2 dollies.
Yeah, it's like pop and soda.
No, I'm just well, I call it pop.
I know.
But I still like I've got I don't know how many 5-gallon buckets I have that I can use because most of them are filled with substrate.
You fish. Oops, sorry. Go ahead.
you might have to go out of the tap water.
Mm.
Like, yeah, I mean, I forgot about the gold gas. That's not affected us here in Michigan, really.
So let's just thinking in my mind, the fact that Ed is the most patient fish keeper I have ever met, which is great. And he's probably going to run his tank for 6 months before anything ever goes in it live, excluding, rock. Do you think that in 6 months of just maintaining that tank and, changing out water, that he's going to get those levels down to, I would say over 6 months, he's going to be dealing with enough algae and water changes to suck all that stuff out of there before he gets to the point of putting corals in there.
Right. Now, how long is he going to wait to put a fish in, though? Because you do need to feed the bacteria with something.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I was just going to fill it with water first and live sand, and then just wing it. I don't ask and say,
I know
okay, what do I
make
do?
the same as they do for freshwater. They make the saltwater bacteria.
Yep.
So I would either put a piece of shrimp or put something in there to keep that cycle going until you put fish in it.
Absolutely.
Now, is it better if you're going to try to do a coral tank? I'm going to figure out how to get 50 gallons of salt from my fish guy. He sells these collapsible buckets that he fills them for nothing. I mean, something. I don't know. He's in here. But I figure I could buy 2 of those collapsible buckets from him. And then, I don't know, I've got at least 2 or 3 5-gallon buckets I used to use for water changes back in Missouri that I never put gas in or anything. I'll just get some extra 5-gallon buckets.
Yeah, there you go.
So, but how long do you need to go until? Is it better to put the corals in or the fish? Is it better to put 2 fish in there and let them start pooping and getting things working?
I would go with the fish first to get it going, and then I would go ahead and then start slowly adding the corals.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And go slow.
Yeah.
So Pew Fish Zone, it's good to see you. Says, do you think the fish will ever get cheaper?
The saltwater fish?
Saltwater fish.
Yes and no. So, there's been quite a few breakthroughs with captive breeding.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I think it was a couple weeks ago they announced that the copper band butterfly fish has now been captive bred. So that's been a pretty big announcement in terms of the captive breeding in the saltwater world. So as more and more of these fish are getting captive bred, we started the Marine Breeding Initiative back in 2010. I helped start it, but I wasn't the founder, I'll call it.
Right.
But when that was started, we went ahead and people were just learning how to do fish rooms in saltwater. So saltwater is about 30 years behind freshwater in terms of a lot of the sort of call it rules, for example. So it's kind of the Wild West. There's not for guppies, you have a standard guppy, right, for each class. For clownfish, there's no standard, so people can just name them whatever they want to name them.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I'm going way off topic. But but at the same time, as more and more of them are being captive bred, there's also regulations hitting in places like Hawaii, for example, where they've shut down the fishery now. So yellow tangs, which used to be $30, are now like $150 because
Yep.
you can't get them anymore captive or wild caught. You have to get them captive raised from Biota, I believe, is doing it,
Right.
and it's a very labor intensive process to breed a lot of those fish. Like clownfish are pretty easy. They're in terms of the fry are small, but they're kind of like cichlids. They spawn in a pot. They're called demersal spawners. But when you start getting to things like tangs, for example, like dory, for example, they're called pelagic spawners, and they'll go ahead and they actually do like a spawning rise. I don't know if you've seen videos of it. We'll do like the male, female will do like a spawning rise, and then those larvae are like extremely tiny. And a lot of the challenges that they've had has been finding the first foods and finding the right copepod, which is like a little, call it microscopic bug, to eat to feed that fish. And they've made a lot of strides in finding the right foods and how to raise a lot of these fish.
Absolutely. No, I think that covered the two key things there. And you could kind of equate those tanks to like zebra plecos in freshwater, because I know the longtime listeners here are familiar with zebra plecos and familiar with, you can't get them anymore, and then the price skyrockets, kind of that thing. Like you mentioned, the breeding is a huge thing with helping bring down prices. And then, Paul had also mentioned, Paul Stero, thank you as always. There's a moratorium, quote, on catching fish in many of the areas that they're usually collected from. Just like
they had even shut down Fiji for a while too. I think was shut down as well.
Yeah. So
yeah,
it really is a yes and no.
The only place that you're getting fish, like if you want a yellow tang that's caught, is the Philippines right now. And there's so few flights coming out of the Philippines, it causes the price way up.
That's true, because what will happen? Just kind of for everyone to I'll walk through the chain of custody real quick. So basically, what happens is there's a diver who's in the Indo-Pacific. Call it the Philippines, Indonesia, Fiji, wherever. They go and catch the fish in the wild. It goes to like a fish market, call it, kind of like the holding place, kind of like you'd see in Corey's video in Peru. Then it gets bagged, gets put on a flight, and almost the majority of the saltwater fish come in through LA, where they're basically reoxygenated and then head to their final destination. And that's a very quick version of it. But so that's basically kind of how the saltwater fish move through the world. And so when you start having pandemics and flights and gas and obviously it's going to change the price structure significantly.
Absolutely. Multiple Aquarium says, James, Ed, and Mike, would you guys ever have a saltwater fish room?
I have.
Yeah, so Mike does. I have been close. I used to do a lot more salt back in the day. Back in my day, that's something I probably would not do again where I am at, but hopefully one day the fish house room build thing, having that the offsite, if you will, place built, gallery, whatever you want to call it. At that point, that would be when it would be feasible for me to have a saltwater fish room or a saltwater section of that building. Until then, it'll probably just be several saltwater tanks.
Yeah, I mean the way you would set that up. I mean the problem with saltwater that's different is in freshwater it's a lot easier to modularize your setup, where each tank is its own self-contained unit. But in saltwater, when you start getting to multiple tanks, you have to have one sump to run. You don't have to, but it's more economical to have one sump to run XY group of tanks.
Right. Absolutely. So that may be something that I might do. So like this is actually a fish store setup with these 275 stacked here. I may be coming upon a couple more of these. So that would probably be the closest I would ever get where I'm at now, would be if I came across 2 more of these or 4 more of these fell into my lap. Because these are already set up to be on one system, like you mentioned, for saltwater for a fish store. So it would be very easy to just take that and set it up in home. But yeah. Ed, are you going to convert your spare room to the saltwater fish room now?
I have a spare room for probably fish eventually someday. It's going to more than likely be spillover for guppies. But if I would ever do saltwater like massive, I would just want one big reef tank, like a 300-gallon reef tank, instead of doing a whole bunch of different little tanks. And then if I did that giant reef tank, I might do like a little frag table or something. But we are talking so far in advance for me. I'm just trying to get my 150-gallon tank working here.
Absolutely.
No, I mean, like I said, I've done it, but it's been more for breeding. So it's a different setup. Breeding setup is very different. It's very, very bare bones, very basic, very like some sand in a pot.
Absolutely. So we've got about 4 more minutes here. Tia Aqua's got a question for us. Says, what do you think about a 33-gallon long saltwater tank? Can it be done, and should I?
Well, Bob Taylor does it.
Yeah.
That's where he grows his spare frags.
I think 33 longs are one of those really, really cool footprints that it's always neat to see what people can do besides just fill it with water and throw crap in it. So I think a really well done nano tank. I would take it upon myself if I were doing that to do the nicest aquascape, if you will, rock work that I could to make it look, super high quality. Again, talking about caliber like we've done on some other things this week. Really raise the bar and set it up and go. It's a really nice looking tank, and it definitely could be. You'd want to think about some things like if you're going to do corals. A lot of corals you probably wouldn't want to do with that limited height. Stick to like the mushrooms, those pallies, things that kind of spread out versus growing up. But I'll turn it over to our resident expert here, Mike. What do you think? Can it and should it be done?
I mean, you could do anything. It all depends on what you want. It's one of these. It's this question that we keep coming back to. It's like, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Oh, well, Flugel even sells like a 15-gallon tank that's set up for salt.
They even have the Flugel. It's not a spec. I forget what they call it for the saltwater version. But the Flugel has the 5-gallon for a nano salt.
There's even little Pico ones too, where you can put little shrimps and stuff.
Yeah. Lunatic Fringe says most of the saltwater goes through sea-dwelling creatures in LA. They supply the public aquarium industry. The Cohen brothers were involved. Always dropping that knowledge. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, then I think Aquatic Aesthetics actually followed up on that, because I was thinking of the same thing. The Quality Marine actually is doing a lot of it now.
There we go. I see that. Lunatic Fringe, very little comes through SDI anymore. They have just done major layoffs. The joys of the economy, right? Like you said, Quality Marine just down the road hired them all. Well, that's awesome that another company picked them up.
Yeah, so I've heard of both companies. I've not really dealt with either of them, because I don't buy wholesale, obviously. So,
yeah, Paul's got a very good point. It says 33 longs are a great size tank. The problem is finding them. Yeah, a lot of times if you find one and somebody already has it, they don't want to give them up. They're hard to get their hands on.
Yeah.
Even though Bobby knows where there's a couple.
Yeah, he does.
We saw him at the store near his house.
He does indeed. So, in closing, we're coming up on the 1 hour mark here. Again, I appreciate both of you all being here. Ed, any final thoughts from your perspective on the talk tonight? Anything that maybe we didn't touch on?
No, I really enjoyed it quite a bit. I can't really add much to it, but I appreciated the stuff that I learned quite a bit. And Daniel mentioned that I should throw a little pinch of food in there daily for a while to cycle it, kind of like cycling a freshwater tank. So without a sponge, that's one way to do it. So, yeah. And Mike mentioned throwing a shrimp in there to let it. And you were referring to a dead shrimp, right? To let it.
Just like a cocktail shrimp. I'm sorry. I should have been more clear.
No, that's what I figured. Well, I might throw a jumbo krill.
Oh, yeah, like a krill, or I didn't mean throw like a neocaridina or something in there.
Yeah. That's what I assumed. But I mean, those are ways to, cycle a freshwater tank too, so it's kind of cool.
Now, one thing that we should hit pretty soon is Aquatic Aesthetics actually brought it up. Not exactly that point, but quarantine. Because because you need to quarantine because it tearing apart a reef tank and trying to fix a reef tank is a very, very bad thing to do if you get ick or velvet, or it's a different game.
It really is. I would equate that to the highest level planted tank with the most expensive discus in it that you could ever find, in terms of how big of a pain in the butt that's going to be and how expensive it could be if you take this $15 damsel and you add it to your beautiful tank that you've got all this time and money invested in, and then you get ick in there because of it. It's definitely something to get on in the future.
Ick is survivable, but velvet is not. Velvet is, I've had a lot of different things because they're wild caught. They come in with, and reef fish are designed that when something goes for them, they dive into the rocks. They're not like rainbow fish that'll just derp around and you catch them. That like their defense mechanism is something's coming, it's diving in the rocks.
Yep.
So you will take every rock out before you can get out all the fish.
Well, I appreciate both of you all being here. Everybody hanging out tonight. Thank you very, very much. If you're catching this on the replay or maybe after the fact you think it's something that maybe we didn't answer, feel free to leave a question down in the comments below. Of course, check out Chattanooga Ed and Fish Tank Farm. Both of their links are in the description. I highly encourage you to go see what they've got going on. I think you'll enjoy it, and I think you'll find yourself subscribing. A huge thank you, as always, to the moderators, the members, the lurkers, the listeners, the super chatters, and contributors, and, of course, the replay crew. I love you guys. Next time, we're going to be discussing substrate and rock. Live sand, live rock. Is it alive? We'll see.
Well, hopefully by then I have some.
All right.
I have some in a bag in the barn, but I have not used it yet.
Oh, wow.
Until next time, my friends, keep your fish healthy, keep yourselves healthy. Of course, catch yourself a little fish from fever. Take care, everybody.